Tonight, we're going back to a time before Christmas was a flawless Instagram moment, before families gathered around decorated trees, before children shook presents and adults pretended to be surprised by gifts they secretly bought for themselves. We're going back to a world where December wasn't magical, it was miserable. A world where snow didn't mean holiday vibes, but rather, we might actually die tonight. This is the real story of how Christmas Eve began. A story that includes frozen peasants, confused Romans, frustrated priests, a terrifying winter solstice, and one bishop who eventually became the world's most successful home intruder. You open your eyes and you're no longer in your room. You're somewhere around the 4th century, a time when calendars were more like polite suggestions, and people counted years based on major events like plagues, invasions, or how many emperors got assassinated that month. You step outside your drafty wooden hut, and the air hits you like a slap from nature. Winter in the ancient world didn't play around. It was cold enough to freeze bread and emotions, and it wasn't even the worst part. The real terror wasn't the cold. The real terror was that nobody knew what the hell was happening with the sun. Every day, it felt like the sun was disappearing earlier and earlier, and the nights were stretching longer and longer, like some cosmic horror film where the darkness keeps creeping in. People didn't say winter solstice. They said things like, "Oh no, here we go again," and "Please, gods, bring the sun back." This fear of endless night is the root of what will eventually become Christmas Eve. But we're not there yet. Right now, Romans are busy celebrating Saturnalia, which is basically a week-long festival of chaos, where everyone drinks like there's no tomorrow, gives gifts for no clear reason, sings songs, mocks their bosses, and occasionally sacrifices something, usually something fluffy and not very enthusiastic about participating. Saturnalia was fun, messy, loud, and full of questionable decisions. If modern office Christmas parties had a grandfather, it would be Saturnalia. But Saturnalia is the kind of grandfather who drinks too much, steals your shoes, and tells you he used to wrestle goats for sport and honor. At this point, Christians are a growing community inside the empire, trying very hard not to get absorbed by the festival madness. Their leaders want a holiday, something foundational, something meaningful, something to gather around that isn't about drunken chanting in the town square. And they needed something that people could remember. So, at some point, someone decides, well, we should celebrate the birth of Jesus, and since nobody wrote down his birthday, we'll just pick one. Now, anyone who has ever tried to choose a movie on Netflix knows that picking anything for a group is a terrible idea. But surprisingly, they did it. December 25th. Nobody knows who picked it. Nobody knows if they were sober. But there it was, stuck right in the middle of winter, practically taped on top of Saturnalia like a banner saying, "Pretend this is new." But humans love anticipation. One day of celebration wasn't enough. If you're going to survive a terrifying winter filled with wolves, icy nights, and ale that tasted like someone soaked old bread in warm water, you needed more than just a single holiday. And so the day before the celebration, December 24th, became a night of gathering, warming up, preparing, storytelling, singing, and desperately hoping that tomorrow would bring some sort of spiritual or physical warmth. This, in its earliest form, was Christmas Eve, a night of huddling together so the cold didn't kill you. There were no trees, no decorated houses, no stockings, no cookies, and definitely no jolly man in a red suit. There were just families sitting around fires that smoked more than they burned, telling stories because it distracted them from the fact that their entire world was made of wood, wind, and danger. People prayed, whispered, and sometimes held hands around the fire, not because it was sweet and loving, but because fires weren't great at staying lit, and someone had to keep an eye on the floor to make sure it didn't ignite. Christmas Eve wasn't cozy. It was survival disguised as spirituality. Fast forward to the Middle Ages. The church has grown, gained power, and developed a long list of rules about absolutely everything. They don't like chaos, and Saturnalia is the definition of chaos. So the church begins shaping Christmas Eve into something more formal. Midnight Mass appears, sermons grow longer, candles are lit, and people are told to behave. The problem is that medieval people had been behaving all year, mostly because they were exhausted from farming, plague, taxes, and whatever war was happening that week. So, yes, they went to Mass. Yes, they lit candles, and yes, they listened to the sermon. But as soon as they stepped outside, the celebrations erupted again. Christmas Eve became this strange mix of solemn ceremony and after-hours festival energy. You'd have priests talking about spiritual purity, while outside someone was roasting a pig, someone else was playing a flute badly, and another person was definitely drunk enough to try climbing a church wall because the angels told him to. But here's the interesting part. The more the church tried to control Christmas Eve, the more traditions people invented around it. Families began preparing special food, usually something expensive they saved for a year. Songs evolved from pagan chants into carols about angels, stars, and miracles. People began giving small gifts, sometimes even lighting candles in windows to guide travelers. Though, half the time, the candles were placed too close to curtains and houses caught fire, which is probably why modern Christmas lights exist. And then enters one of the most influential figures in this entire history, Saint Nicholas. Not the Coca-Cola Santa, not the mall Santa, not the overly jolly man with questionable fashion choices. The real Saint Nicholas was a bishop from Myra, serious, stern, and nothing like a man you'd imagine sliding down chimneys for fun. But he had a habit of secretly giving money to poor families at night, usually tossing coins into houses so the recipients wouldn't know who to thank. Over centuries, these stories grew, twisted, exaggerated, combined with Northern European traditions, and eventually transformed into a magical figure who delivered gifts on Christmas Eve. At first, the idea terrified people. Imagine living in the Middle Ages, already stressed from plagues, wolves, and tax collectors, and then someone tells you a supernatural man will visit your home at night. Of course you'd be scared. But gradually, the idea softened. People liked the thought of a gift giver who came in the darkness, not as a threat, but as a symbol of hope. And so Christmas Eve took on a new identity, the night of mystery, quiet expectation, and gentle magic. By the time we reach the Renaissance and beyond, Christmas Eve starts becoming recognizable. Families gather intentionally, not just for warmth, but for celebration. Food becomes abundant, or at least more varied. Music becomes more joyful. Fires are lit not out of fear of freezing, but out of tradition. And the stories, oh, the stories, tales of miracles, spirits, angels, and legends, all tied to this one night. Some stories were heartwarming, others were terrifying. There were tales of spirits visiting sinners, children encountering mysterious travelers, animals speaking at midnight, and the dead rising to check on the living. Christmas Eve was part Holy Night, part Ghost Story Festival, and nobody seemed to find that strange. Then came the modern era. Industrialization allowed people to have more consistent food, warmth, and time to relax. Writers took ancient traditions and reshaped them into the romantic, glowing version of Christmas we know today. Dickens added ghosts and morality. Poets added Santa sneaking around rooftops. Advertisers added bright colors. German traditions added trees, toys, and gingerbread. And suddenly, Christmas Eve wasn't about surviving the night anymore. It became about creating warmth on purpose. A night of lights against the darkness. A night of gathering instead of hiding. A night of family instead of fear. But look closely. Even today, with all the decorations, music, movies, and commercial sparkle, Christmas Eve still carries the ancient feeling it started with. That quiet pause. That moment when the world seems to slow down. When the night feels heavier, calmer, and somehow meaningful. We don't fear the darkness anymore, but we still respect it. We don't pray for the sun to return, but we still light our homes with glowing warmth. We don't tell stories to distract ourselves from wolves, but we still tell stories because deep down, humans always gather in the dark to comfort each other. That is the real beginning of Christmas Eve. Not a single moment, not a single event, but a slow evolution from fear to hope, from freezing nights to glowing warmth, from ancient rituals to modern celebration. Christmas Eve started as a desperate night where people clung to each other for survival, and over centuries became a night where people come together out of love, tradition, and shared humanity. You would think that once the idea of Christmas Eve finally evolved into something halfway organized, humanity would simply relax and enjoy it. But no, humans have one unique skill that transcends time periods, empires, religions, and geography. We constantly change things even when nobody asks us to. So as centuries rolled forward, Christmas Eve kept transforming, shifting like a story whispered around a fire, each generation adding its own flavor. And flavor is exactly what the early modern Europeans were obsessed with, especially as trade exploded and spices poured into Europe like gold dust. Suddenly, Christmas Eve didn't just smell like smoke and sheep wool. It smelled like cinnamon, nutmeg, cloves, and sugar. Luxuries that used to be worth more than your entire village. Imagine peasants from the Middle Ages suddenly walking into an 18th century kitchen. They would pass out from shock just hearing the word gingerbread, let alone tasting it. But even before cinnamon became the unofficial smell of December, Christmas Eve was already turning into something more theatrical. The church, the nobles, and everyday people all wanted a piece of this night, but for different reasons. The church wanted order and holiness. Nobles wanted a chance to show off their wealth. Poorer families wanted relief from the harshness of winter. And children, well, children didn't have toys or television or anything fun, really, so the idea of a magical winter night was enough to keep them awake with excitement they couldn't even understand. It's almost adorable until you remember these same children were also working in fields, dodging plagues, and sometimes being put in charge of dangerous animals because, apparently, medieval parents were experts in risk they didn't acknowledge. Now, as the Renaissance bloomed and Europe rediscovered art, music, drama, and the power of storytelling, Christmas Eve began to gather mythologies from everywhere like a giant snowball rolling downhill. Scandinavia contributed tales of Yule, spirits, and mysterious gift-bringers. Germany brought in the decorated tree. The British Isles, never ones to be outdone, added ghost stories, winter feasts, and supernatural folklore. It wasn't uncommon for families to sit around the fire on Christmas Eve and tell eerie stories about spirits wandering the earth. Yes, the same night the church called holy, Europeans called perfect for scaring each other half to death. It sounds strange now, But even writers like Charles Dickens would later keep this tradition alive, blending winter warmth with ghostly visitation in a way that made Christmas feel like a bridge between the living and the otherworldly. As the 1600s and 1700s unfolded, entire towns began to shape Christmas Eve according to local culture. Some lit huge bonfires meant to echo ancient solstice fires. Some baked bread shaped into symbols of protection. Some sang hymns all night long. Others got drunk so spectacularly that local authorities had to create no excessive singing after midnight laws, which of course people ignored immediately. The line between sacred and chaotic was thin, and Christmas Eve danced directly on top of it with both feet. Then something happened that would change the trajectory of Christmas forever. People started writing about it. Writers, poets, travelers, and clergy began describing their Christmas Eve traditions in letters and books. Suddenly, traditions weren't just local, they spread. If a German town decorated a tree, English travelers wrote about it. If a French village performed midnight plays, Italian priests adopted them. If a Nordic region carved small wooden animals for children, Dutch traders carried the idea across oceans. Christmas Eve became a cultural exchange program centuries before the concept existed. And that cultural exchange wasn't limited to Europe. Because while all this was happening, people were sailing across the world, some voluntarily, some not. Colonization, trade, exploration, exile, and migration blended traditions into something new. In the New World, especially in the American colonies, people from dozens of backgrounds were trying to celebrate in whatever way felt familiar. English Puritans tried to ban Christmas altogether, declaring it too sinful. Germans, meanwhile, responded by celebrating harder, louder, and with so many ornaments that Puritans complained the decorations were distracting God. Dutch settlers brought their version of St. Nicholas, known as Sinterklaas. Scandinavian settlers introduced Yule logs and evergreen traditions. This chaotic melting pot eventually created one of the greatest cultural fusions ever, the birth of the American-style Christmas Eve. It was loud, mixed, colorful, influenced by half the planet, and completely unapologetic. And as the centuries turned, this fusion only grew stronger. Now, if you zoom out and look at the entire timeline, you start to see how absurdly human the whole evolution is. Christmas Eve began as a night of fear and uncertainty. Then it became a night of candlelit prayers. Then a night of community feasting. Then a night of storytelling. Then a night of quiet magic. Then a night of gifts. Then a night of family togetherness. And then, sometime in the early 1800s, it started turning into something even bigger, a night of imagination. This is the era when writers began shaping the version of Christmas Eve we recognize today. Poets wrote verses about winter miracles. Storytellers described sleigh bells, snow-covered rooftops, and magical visitors. It was around this time that Santa evolved from the stern bishop depicted in church art into the jolly, generous, mythical figure we know. Illustrators added fur-lined clothing. Writers added reindeer. People added customs like leaving out food, first for travelers, then for spirits, then for St. Nicholas. The idea that Christmas Eve was a night when something magical might happen began spreading from home to home until it became universal. Of course, not every part of Christmas Eve's evolution was whimsical. Many cultures added superstitions because old habits die hard. In some regions, people believed animals could speak at midnight. In others, they believed the dead returned to visit their homes. Some believed that dreams on Christmas Eve were prophetic. Others believed baking bread after sunset would curse the household. And in certain places, people left their doors unlocked that night because no evil spirit would dare disturb the holy hours, which was an impressive amount of optimism for communities that regularly locked their doors against real, living threats like thieves, raiders, and bears. As the 19th century unfolded, Christmas Eve gained full cultural momentum. Families decorated trees together, children hung stockings, communities organized choirs, and storytellers created tales to enchant young listeners. Newspapers began publishing Christmas stories. Schools held small Christmas Eve performances. Even factories, known for exhausting their workers to the brink of collapse, often gave people half a day off so they could prepare for the holiday. That alone shows how important Christmas Eve became. If an industrial factory in 1830s London is voluntarily letting you leave early, something big is happening. Then came the big turning point, the point where Christmas Eve stopped being a cluster of traditions and officially transformed into a global phenomenon. Technology arrived. Printing presses made books and cards widely available. Trains let families travel to spend the holiday together. Cities lit up with gas lamps and eventually electric lights, giving Christmas Eve the sparkling glow we now take for granted. And then, somewhere in this glowing mix of tradition and modernity, Christmas Eve became a symbol, not of fear, not of cold, not of danger, but of hope in the darkest nights of the year. But this is just the surface, because beneath the cozy blankets, the warm lights, the hot drinks, and the cheerful music, Christmas Eve still carries echoes of its ancient past. The silence of winter nights, the gathering of families around warmth, the pause before the morning, the anticipation of something good arriving, all of this is thousands of years old. Even if we no longer sit in terror, wondering if the sun will return, we still feel something during Christmas Eve. A softness, a hush, a feeling that the world is holding its breath. Now imagine walking through time. Imagine standing in a Roman home during Saturnalia as they feast and joke. Then stepping into a medieval hut where families huddle around a fire, whispering prayers. Then into a Renaissance village where people sing carols in narrow cobblestone streets. Then into an 18th century European manor filled with candles and evergreen branches. Then into a 19th century American living room with stockings hung by a fireplace. Each version of Christmas Eve looks wildly different, and yet every single one shares the same heartbeat. People gathering in the dark, finding warmth together, and reminding themselves that winter won't last forever. And maybe that's the most poetic part. Christmas Eve didn't begin because someone wrote it into a law. It didn't begin because of a single event. It began because people, everywhere, instinctively needed a night like it. A night of pause. A night of light in the darkness. A night to remind themselves that life continues, that warmth survives, that hope returns. The traditions changed, the decorations changed, the legends changed, but the soul of Christmas Eve stayed the same. It's the night humanity collectively told the darkness, "You don't win." As Christmas Eve continued evolving through centuries, one thing became clear. The night had become a stage, and every culture performed its own play upon it. Some performances were solemn, some joyful, some downright strange, and some so chaotic that if you wrote them into a movie script, people would accuse you of being unrealistic. Yet every piece of this global collage helped shape the Christmas Eve we know today. Imagine walking into a 17th century English village. Snow is falling, but it's not the beautiful snow you see in holiday films. It's wet, heavy, probably mixed with soot from the chimneys, and cold enough to make your fingers regret their existence. The streets are narrow, muddy, and lined with houses that lean at such uncomfortable angles you'd assume the builders were drunk or guessing. But inside these crooked homes, Christmas Eve is happening. Families are roasting whatever food they manage to save from the year. Maybe a goose, maybe a chicken, maybe something the father swears is a rabbit, but suspiciously looks like a large rat. Children are waiting wide-eyed for the promise of a magical night. The fireplace crackles, filling the room with warmth and the faint smell of burning wood, burning food, and occasionally burning socks someone left too close to the flames. Outside, the church bells ring. People gather for the evening service, kids half asleep and adults half drunk. The service is long, the building is freezing, and the priest is trying to keep everyone spiritually awake, although he is battling centuries of tradition where Christmas Eve sermons are notorious for turning half the village into snoring statues. The moment church ends, though, the true celebration begins. People hug, laugh, sing, and then head home where games, songs, and food will last deep into the night. This isn't the Christmas Eve shown on postcards. This is the real one. Messy, loud, imperfect, but full of heart. Now move to Germany during the same era. The Germans had a knack for taking Christmas traditions and making them grand. Their Christmas Eve rituals included identical elements to others: music, candles, family gatherings, but also something new: the Christmas tree. Early versions weren't heavily decorated. They might have apples, small candles, bits of bread, or wooden carvings. The idea wasn't beauty, it was symbolism. The tree represented life in the dead of winter. It stood tall and green while everything else froze or died. Lighting candles on the tree wasn't meant to be aesthetic. It was a bold statement that light wins over darkness, even if that light was precariously balanced on dry fir branches, waiting to turn the living room into an accidental funeral pyre. Meanwhile, in Italy, Christmas Eve took on a different flavor, literally. Italians embraced the night with feasts, especially in coastal regions where fish dishes became central. The lights were warm, the houses filled with music, and the atmosphere richer than most parts of Europe. That's because Italians, even in centuries past, fully understood that holidays required three things: food, more food, and people loudly debating the quality of the food. In the colder northern regions, Scandinavia, Finland, Iceland, Christmas Eve held on to ancient traditions with a firm grip. Here, old pagan customs, songs, blessings, and rituals were woven seamlessly into Christian celebrations. Yule logs burned through the night, homes stayed lit, and people believed the world thinned on this night, that spirits, animals, and ancestors could cross between realms. It wasn't a night of fear, it was a night of reverence. A night where the living and the dead shared the same winter breath for a moment. And then there was Eastern Europe, where Christmas Eve carried a deep sense of mystery. Families left an empty chair at the table for wandering souls, believing no one should be alone on this night. Straw was often placed under the tablecloth to symbolize the manger. Food was carefully chosen. Nothing that symbolized violence, nothing too rich, and nothing wasted. Christmas Eve here wasn't just celebration, it was sacred memory. Across these lands, cultures, languages, and traditions, Christmas Eve slowly became a universal moment, a night where humans, no matter how different, wanted the same thing: warmth, comfort, safety, and a small touch of magic. Then came the Victorian Age, and everything sped up. The Victorians, with their inventions, their literature, their innovations, and their newfound obsession with sentimental family life, radically influenced Christmas Eve. They were the original holiday influencers. Christmas cards became a thing. Carols were rewritten, repackaged, and reintroduced. Wealthy households hosted lavish dinners, and even poorer families saved coins all year to buy a little treat for the night. During this time, the idea of Christmas Eve transformed yet again, now into a night centered around togetherness, storytelling, and the expectation of joy. If earlier generations braced themselves for winter survival, the Victorians braced themselves for emotional moments. The hearth became the symbol of home. The tree became the heart of decoration. Stockings shifted from European tradition to a global symbol of childhood wonder. And Santa, once a strange mix of bishop, folklore, and myth, became the jolly visitor recognized almost everywhere. By the late 1800s, trains were connecting families across countries, allowing people to travel home for the holiday. Cities installed electric lights, turning Christmas Eve into a gleaming spectacle of brightness cutting through the night. For the first time in history, the world at night didn't look so terrifying. Electricity softened the winter darkness. It made Christmas Eve feel safe, almost enchanted. In America, Christmas Eve rapidly evolved. Communities from dozens of origins fused their traditions, together, forming something spirited and colorful. German clubs introduced the Christmas tree widely. Dutch settlers kept the St. Nicholas tradition alive. Irish families added songs and gatherings. African American communities shaped carols, church traditions, and storytelling. Immigrants from all over Europe brought their foods, rituals, and beliefs. And because the U.S. is a place where traditions mix like ingredients in a giant holiday stew, Christmas Eve became a wildly creative celebration. The night grew brighter as advertisements, illustrations, and eventually films began cementing Christmas as a cultural phenomenon. Newspapers printed Christmas stories. Magazines illustrated cozy homes glowing with firelight. Families took portraits by decorated trees. And department stores began staging Christmas Eve experiences to draw people into the holiday spirit and their cash registers. Through the early 20th century, Christmas Eve gained new layers. Radio broadcasts filled the night with music and readings. Military families overseas found comfort in holiday messages, broadcast through static-filled frequencies. Children listened to bedtime stories narrated by warm, familiar voices. Families tuned in together, united by the invisible thread of sound waves cutting across distance and darkness. Then television arrived, adding moving images to the holiday. Films, shows, holiday specials, all of them poured emotion, comedy, drama, nostalgia, magic, and sentimentality onto the screen. By this time, Christmas Eve had fully transformed. No longer a night of survival, no longer a night split between solemnity and chaos. It had become a ritual, a rhythm, a worldwide moment of pause. And yet, despite all the modernization, the old roots still lingered in the shadows. Families still gathered around light sources, now electric, but symbolically identical to ancient fires. People still exchanged gifts, now wrapped in shiny paper instead of tucked into wooden shoes or tossed through windows. They still shared meals, told stories, sang songs, and stayed awake a little later than usual. The essence was untouched. The deeper you look, the more you realize Christmas Eve survived because it answers something inside us. Even in today's world, a world glowing with screens, buzzing with notifications, drowning in noise, Christmas Eve carves out a different kind of silence. A silence not created by the absence of sound, but by the presence of meaning. Imagine the scene today, A family gathers in a warm home. Lights shimmer softly. A tree stands decorated, glowing like a small universe. Outside, the cold presses against the windows, but inside, everything feels safe, familiar, glowing. Children fall asleep early, trying to hold on to excitement. Parents whisper, preparing gifts or food. A movie plays softly. Somewhere, someone sings a carol. Somewhere else, someone stares at the lights and reflects on the year. And millions of people feel the same thing at the same time. A quiet blend of nostalgia, hope, longing, comfort, and something almost ancient. Because it is ancient. It's thousands of years of humans gathering against the darkness, shared across cultures, religions, continents, and centuries. That's why Christmas Eve has the emotional power it does. It carries the weight of history, from Roman festivals to medieval fears, from pagan fires to Christian rituals, from ghost stories to children's dreams, from candlelit masses to glowing cities. People sometimes ask why Christmas Eve feels more magical than Christmas Day, why the atmosphere is thicker, why the emotions run deeper. The simple reason is that Christmas Day is the celebration, but Christmas Eve is the anticipation. And anticipation is the oldest form of human longing. It connects us to every generation before us, to every family that ever sat around a fire, to every child who ever tried to stay awake, hoping for a miracle. Christmas Eve isn't one tradition. It's all of them woven together, like threads of a tapestry that stretches across time. The idea of Christmas Eve, however, did not remain a simple farmer's ritual for long. Traditions have a strange way of attracting other traditions, the way a candle flame pulls in moths. As villages grew into market towns, and market towns grew into cities with narrow stone alleys and squares full of shouting merchants, the old solstice customs adapted to the rhythm of human ambition. People still gathered on the longest night, but their gatherings became louder, more layered, and far more symbolic. Some lit candles in their homes because their grandmothers had done so. Others did it because they heard that fire helped guide spirits back across the veil. Still others lit candles for no reason at all except that it made the cold room feel less empty. It was a night that meant something different to everyone, yet somehow remained shared by all. In the centuries leading up to the early Middle Ages, that shared night began to pull new stories into itself. Traveling storytellers, wandering monks, pagan bards, and shrewd merchants, all of them contributed pieces to the cultural stew simmering across Europe. Some spoke of a mother night, a mystical evening when a divine mother gave birth to hope. Others spoke of a watch night, when people stayed awake to protect their homes from unseen forces drifting through the dark. Even in places where no single religion reigned, the idea of a night pregnant with symbolism resonated deeply. After all, winter was hard, food ran low, illness ran high. The futures of families were never guaranteed. So having one night where everyone paused and leaned toward the fragile flame of hope became something society wasn't willing to let go of. When Christianity began to spread through Europe, it did not try to erase that night entirely. Conquering customs is nearly impossible. Adopting them is far easier. And so the idea of celebrating the birth of Christ near the solstice was not so much a theological calculation as a cultural strategy. Early Christian communities recognized that people already had a powerful emotional tether to this date, the night when light and dark reached a kind of cosmic standoff. Rather than break that tether, they retied it. They reframed the night as holy rather than pagan, divine rather than mystical, but kept the innate emotional core intact. And in doing so, they planted the earliest seeds of what we now call Christmas Eve. But even then, Christmas Eve did not yet resemble the soft, glowing, candlelit evening we picture today. In fact, it was far stranger. In early medieval villages, the night before Christmas could feel like a mixture of celebration, fear, superstition, and relief. Bells rang not because they were festive, but because people believed the sound could chase away lingering winter spirits. Fires were stacked high because the cold was deadly, but also because fire symbolized the triumph of divine light. Small wooden figurines were placed on tables not as decorations, but as tokens of protection. And prayers were whispered with the same intensity that ancient farmers once reserved for pleading with the solstice gods. As the church grew more organized, so did the rituals surrounding Christmas Eve. Midnight masses became a common thread that wove through countless regions. People dressed in their finest clothing, even if finest simply meant a cloak without holes, and trudged through the snow to stone chapels lit by flickering torches. Inside, the air smelled of melted wax, damp wool, and incense, thick enough to choke the cold. The priest would speak of a quiet birth in Bethlehem, while outside the wind howled like a creature beating its claws against the wooden doors. It didn't matter that most villagers had never seen a desert or a stable or a swaddled infant. What mattered was that for one night, the world felt suspended between the ordinary and the miraculous. Still, Christmas Eve remained more than a religious ceremony. It was a night of deep cultural psychology. In almost every town, from the British Isles to the Balkans, people believed that the boundary between worlds thinned on this night. The good could enter. The evil could too. This is why children were told to behave, not merely to avoid earthly punishment, but to avoid attracting something far worse. It's also why households left out bread or milk or a little bowl of grain on the table before going to bed. Some said it was for wandering ancestors. Others said it was for angels who traveled incognito. Some whispered that if you didn't offer something, something else might take it anyway. Yet as centuries passed, the tone of Christmas Eve slowly softened. The fear did not vanish, but it was overshadowed by tenderness. People began to associate the night with family more than spirits, with warmth more than dread, with gathering more than guarding. As medieval economies stabilized, even if only slightly, families could afford to save a few special ingredients for this one night: a piece of dried fruit, a small hunk of cheese, a rare pinch of spice, or, for the truly fortunate, a shard of sugar. The modesty of these foods made them precious. Sharing them felt sacred, and from these humble beginnings, the tradition of the Christmas Eve feast was born. Not the lavish modern kind, but a quiet meal that reminded people they had survived another year together. By the late Middle Ages, the story of Christmas Eve had expanded once again. Legends began to swirl, some whimsical, some ominous. In the forests of Germany, people told tales of the Christmas hunt, a ghostly procession led by a spectral king that roared across the sky on the longest nights. In Scandinavia, families believed that animals gained the power to speak at midnight, though it was considered dangerous to listen. In the Mediterranean, people lit extra candles to ward off mischievous spirits who delighted in stealing food. And across the Alps, children were warned that if they misbehaved all year, a horned creature would drag them into the snow. Hope and fear braided together, strengthening the cultural rope of the holiday. Despite all these variations, one pattern became universal. Christmas Eve transformed into a night where the world seemed to exhale. Work paused, tools were put away, markets quieted. Even the belligerent local drunk staggered home earlier than usual. The night demanded respect, whether spiritual or superstitious, joyful or solemn. It was a threshold, 1 foot in the old year, 1 foot in the new. A night for reflection, gratitude, and the fragile belief that tomorrow might be better. As Europe entered the early Renaissance, literacy began to rise, and with it, the written preservation of Christmas traditions. The night started to appear in poems, songs, devotional texts, and eventually printed books. Storytellers embellished older tales, adding warmth, nostalgia, and even humor. Christmas Eve gradually evolved from a communal ritual into a narrative, a story Europe told itself every year, a story about light in darkness, family in hardship, birth in barrenness, and hope without certainty. But perhaps the most transformative shift came not from religion or folklore, but from simple human nature. Winter is long, and hope is necessary. People didn't want the longest night to feel heavy with fear forever. So they reimagined it, they reshaped it, they filled it with tenderness. They created a tradition that took the coldest, darkest evening of the year and made it glow. And little by little, Christmas Eve became less about surviving the night and more about savoring it. Families gathered earlier in the evening, telling stories by the fire. Craftsmen carved small toys for children. Bakers prepared dough that would rise by morning. Musicians played soft melodies on flutes and lutes. Neighbors exchanged simple gifts, sometimes nothing more than a carved spoon or a small candle. And children, for the first time in history, felt excitement instead of unease as they crawled into bed on this night. It was during this period that the idea of an eve, a sacred, anticipatory evening, became solidly defined. An eve was not simply the day before. It was a night charged with emotional electricity, a night where time felt slower, a night that belonged not just to ritual, but to the imagination. The Christmas story had become not just a religious tale, but a cultural heartbeat. And as the Renaissance gave way to the early modern era, the tradition continued to evolve. Households placed evergreen branches over doorways, not just as symbols of eternal life, but as reminders that even in winter, the world carried the memory of spring. Candles multiplied, their warm halos pushing back against the cold. Hymns and carols began to spread, first in churches, then on street corners, then from house to house. Christmas Eve became an orchestra, played not with instruments, but with footsteps, whispers, laughter, and distant bells. Across Europe, the meaning of the night stretched further. It became a moment when time bent, when past and present seemed to meet. Families remembered the dead. They blessed the living. They forgave grudges, sometimes sincerely, sometimes just for the night. If someone had traveled far, Christmas Eve was the night they hoped to return home. If someone had gone missing, Christmas Eve was the night their empty chair felt most poignant. If someone had been born recently, Christmas Eve was a reminder of how every birth carried the promise of renewal. By the time the world reached the early 18th century, Christmas Eve had transformed from a regional winter ritual into a pan-European tradition woven into the fabric of identity. It had traveled through paganism, absorbed folklore, been reshaped by Christianity, softened by family life, and deepened by centuries of storytelling. It was no longer about the solstice or spirits or even strictly about religion. It was about the human need for light in darkness, for companionship in hardship, and for meaning in the bleakest season of the year. And so, without anyone planning it, Christmas Eve became something universal, a gentle pause, a shared breath, a collective heartbeat. And yet, its evolution was far from over. The coming centuries would introduce new characters, new myths, new decorations, and new ideals, from roaring fireplaces in England to candlelit windows in Eastern Europe to early versions of Santa figures roaming the streets. Each region would add its own flavor. Each generation would reinterpret what the night meant. And each family, in each quiet home, surrounded by winter's dark curtain, would continue weaving their own small thread into the vast tapestry of Christmas Eve. As Europe stepped into the 18th century, Christmas Eve began to evolve again, shaped now by shifting politics, expanding cities, and the slow but steady rise of global trade. New goods arrived from distant corners of the world, spices from the East, citrus from the Mediterranean, sugar from colonial plantations. These new ingredients didn't simply transform kitchens, they transformed traditions. What had once been a single precious pinch of cinnamon, saved for the year's holiest night, became, in some households, a staple of the Christmas Eve table. Oranges, once exotic treasures fit only for the wealthiest merchants, became rare but cherished tokens slipped into children's hands. Sugar, though still expensive, made its way into breads and pastries that filled winter evenings with a sweetness older generations could scarcely imagine. And so Christmas Eve, bit by bit, became a holiday not just of meaning, but of flavor. Yet those were merely surface changes. Beneath them, deeper shifts were underway. Enlightenment ideas rippled across Europe, challenging old superstitions, questioning old narratives, and reshaping how people understood the world. But Christmas Eve survived this intellectual storm with surprising resilience. The Enlightenment could strip away fear, but it could not extinguish wonder. People no longer spoke as often of spirits slipping across the threshold, or animals whispering at midnight, but they still lit candles, still gathered in warmth, still clung to the symbolic weight of the night. If anything, with the fading of superstition, Christmas Eve became gentler, more sentimental. The focus began shifting decisively toward family, reflection, and the intimate atmosphere created by a shared night. In cities like London, Paris, and Vienna, Christmas Eve took on a new layer of social life. Streets glowed with lanterns, and homes adorned their windows with single candles, an inviting sign that the night was special. Wealthy households hosted elegant dinners, while working families saved a small portion of their earnings for modest but meaningful treats. Bakers' shops stayed open longer, their warm air rolling into the cold streets as last-minute buyers queued for bread, sweet rolls, or warm mulled wine. And in every neighborhood, children pressed their noses against frosted windows, staring out at a world transformed, even if only by imagination, into something enchanted. It was also during this era that the idea of the Christmas Eve gift slowly spread. Earlier generations had exchanged tokens on Christmas Day, or in some regions, on St. Nicholas Day. But as traditions blended and families sought small ways to express affection, the custom of giving a tiny present on Christmas Eve, a carved toy, a knitted scarf, a wooden puzzle, gained popularity. It was not extravagance that fueled this practice, but symbolism. Giving a gift on the threshold of Christmas felt like placing hope into someone's hands, a quiet promise that the coming day held joy. Meanwhile, in rural regions that remained slower to industrialize, Christmas Eve retained a more ancient rhythm. Families gathered by the hearth, telling stories passed down through generations. The crackle of fire replaced the sounds of the city, and outside, snow muffled the world into stillness. In Scandinavia, straw ornaments were braided and hung on beams. In Eastern Europe, a thin layer of hay was spread beneath the tablecloth to symbolize the stable in Bethlehem, its faint rustle a reminder of humble beginnings. In the Balkans, families baked ceremonial breads, decorating them with symbolic patterns that foretold luck for the coming year. Each village had its unique customs, yet all shared the belief that this night deserved reverence. And then came one of the most significant influences on Christmas Eve: literature. The 19th century saw an explosion of printed stories, poems, and songs that reshaped how people thought about the holiday. Writers like Charles Dickens reimagined the season not merely as a religious observance, but as a celebration of compassion, redemption, and generosity. His work did not invent Christmas spirit, but it distilled and amplified what society already longed for: warmth in the coldest season, kindness in a world often hardened by poverty and class divides, and second chances on the final nights of the year. Christmas Eve, in particular, became framed as a moment of transformation, a night when hearts softened, grudges fell silent, and humanity briefly remembered its own tenderness. Stories spread faster than rituals ever had. Printed songs traveled from town to town, introducing new melodies and lyrics that became staples of Christmas Eve gatherings. Families began singing together, their voices rising in harmony as candles flickered and shadows danced on stone walls or wooden beams. Children learned carols from their grandparents, and travelers carried those same melodies across borders, weaving them into the cultural fabric of entire nations. Music had an uncanny ability to unify, and Christmas Eve became one of the most musical nights of the year. But literature and music did something else too. They created a shared imaginary Christmas. Even households that lacked wealth or comfort could step into a collective story of warmth, light, and hope. The idea of Christmas Eve became almost theatrical: the dim lighting, the glow of candles, the hush before midnight, the anticipation of something magical. This sense of staged wonder didn't make the night less sincere. It made it more meaningful. Reality could be harsh, especially in the 19th century, but stories allowed people to elevate the night, to hold on to beauty even when life gave them little of it. As industrialization reshaped Europe, uprooting families from rural villages and pulling them into crowded cities, Christmas Eve gained an unexpected emotional weight. For many workers, the holiday became the rare moment of rest after long hours in factories and sweatshops. Employers sometimes granted a half day on Christmas Eve, a gesture that workers cherished. Families who had once lived close to extended relatives now found themselves isolated, relying on new traditions to recreate the sense of community they'd lost. And so Christmas Eve became not just a cultural event, but an anchor, a night that reminded people of who they were and where they came from. Across the Atlantic, the night evolved in parallel but distinct ways. In North America, European immigrants brought their customs with them, blending them into a new mosaic. German families introduced the Christmas tree. Dutch communities carried tales of St. Nicholas. British settlers brought carols and plum puddings. Scandinavian immigrants lit candles in windows to guide travelers. These traditions fused in ways that felt organic, creating the uniquely American image of Christmas Eve. A cozy home glowing with candles, stockings hung by the fireplace, families reading stories aloud, and children barely able to sleep. The rise of Santa Claus as a cultural figure further shaped the night's identity. While earlier versions of gift bringers existed across Europe, the American Santa, jolly, bearded, and unmistakably magical, became a defining symbol of Christmas Eve. His association with the night before Christmas cemented the evening as one of anticipation and wonder for children. Suddenly, Christmas Eve wasn't just a spiritual threshold. It became a storybook moment, a night charged with excitement, imagination, and the thrill of possibility. By the late 19th century, Christmas Eve had become more universal, more sentimental, and more recognizable to us today. Families decorated homes with greenery and candles. Churches performed elaborate midnight services with choirs and orchestras. Markets brimmed with winter treats, and children rehearsed pageants that reenacted the nativity story. The night glowed with warmth, creativity, and communal joy. Yet for all its evolution, Christmas Eve's core remained remarkably unchanged. It was still a night of gathering, a night of pause, a night of storytelling in all its forms, spoken, sung, and enacted. Whether in a small cottage with a single candle or in a bustling city square illuminated by gas lamps, the essence of the night held strong: light against darkness, hope against hardship, companionship against isolation. What had begun as ancient rituals honoring the solstice had become a tapestry of traditions woven across continents. Through centuries of war, famine, migration, and cultural transformation, one truth endured: humans needed this night. They needed a moment to stand still in the midst of winter's grip and declare that warmth, kindness, and wonder still mattered. And so Christmas Eve continued to evolve as it entered the 20th century, shaped now by new technologies, global travel, and rapidly changing social norms. But its foundation, its emotional DNA, remained as steady as the flame of a candle in a quiet room. As the 20th century dawned, the world transformed at a speed earlier generations could scarcely imagine. Railways stitched distant towns together, electricity illuminated streets and homes, and newspapers delivered stories from continents away. Christmas Eve, once a quiet, locally focused night, began to acquire a broader, almost global identity. People no longer simply relied on oral tradition or local rituals. Print media and later radio allowed the ideas of this night to travel far beyond village borders. In Europe, newspapers printed seasonal recipes, craft patterns for decorations, and schedules of church services, while in America, magazines began to feature color illustrations of holiday scenes, showing families gathered around blazing hearths, children peeking at stockings, and Christmas trees adorned with candles and early ornaments. These images became templates, subtly shaping how people imagined the night, creating a shared cultural picture that extended beyond any single household or region. With electricity spreading into homes, the ambiance of Christmas Eve began to shift. Candles still glowed in windows, but incandescent bulbs and strings of lights added a new layer of warmth and spectacle. In urban centers, streets sparkled with illumination, drawing neighbors out into the cold air to admire the displays. Children who had once peeked anxiously into frosted windows now gasped at the magical glow of entire blocks decorated in brilliant color. The excitement of the night intensified, but it remained intertwined with the old emotions: anticipation, reflection, wonder, and a sense that this evening was different, sacred, and fleeting. Despite the increasing commercialization that would later dominate, the heart of Christmas Eve remained personal, domestic, and deeply emotional. The First World War brought new dimensions to the night. Soldiers far from home, entrenched in mud and snow, longed desperately for the traditions of Christmas Eve they had left behind. Letters became lifelines, carrying stories of decorated trees, shared meals, and prayers whispered in warmth. In some cases, soldiers in the trenches recreated miniature versions of the night, carving small wooden tokens, singing carols quietly to one another, or arranging whatever scraps of greenery they could find to mimic a tree. Even amidst the chaos and devastation of war, Christmas Eve maintained its power to inspire hope. In fact, it may have been more vital than ever, serving as a brief portal to a world unscarred by violence, a reminder that human kindness and connection could endure despite the horrors around them. The post-war period brought with it prosperity for some and modernization for all. Cities expanded, suburbs emerged, and consumer goods became more widely available. Christmas Eve transformed once again. It became a night not only for reflection and storytelling, but also for preparation for gift-giving in earnest. Department stores displayed elaborate windows depicting scenes from nativity stories, Santa's workshop, and festive cityscapes. Children pressed their noses against these panes of glass, just as their ancestors had pressed them against frosted windows centuries before. But now the scenes were dramatically more elaborate, infused with narrative, color, and theatricality. These displays, while commercial, reinforced the emotional significance of the night, a blend of anticipation, delight, and imagination that echoed the centuries-old tradition of storytelling by firelight. Radio, which emerged in the 1920s, transformed the shared experience of Christmas Eve even further. Families could now listen together to carols, readings, and seasonal music from faraway towns and even other countries. A broadcast could carry the voice of a choir, the sound of bells, and the reading of classic holiday stories directly into homes. Suddenly, the night could be experienced collectively on a scale unimaginable to medieval villagers. Despite the technological leap, the essential magic endured. People huddled together in warmth, hearts attuned to stories, music, and ritual, reaffirming the sense that Christmas Eve was a pause from ordinary life, a night set apart, a thread connecting countless households through shared expectation and emotion. In rural areas, the old rhythms persisted, blending seamlessly with new technologies. Farms lit with electric lights, but still centered on hearth and family, retained their traditions. Ceremonial breads, the careful setting of the table for absent spirits or guests, and the telling of stories. Even as the world outside changed, the internal, emotional cadence of the night remained remarkably stable. It is in this blending of old and new that the resilience of Christmas Eve becomes clear. It is both deeply adaptive and remarkably enduring, able to incorporate the modern world without losing its core emotional resonance. The Great Depression of the 1930s added a different layer of meaning. Economic hardship made elaborate gifts rare, yet the night retained, and perhaps even amplified, its emotional significance. Families compensated for the lack of material abundance with care, creativity, and attention. Handcrafted gifts, small gestures of generosity, and the simple sharing of food became central. A loaf of bread, a bit of sugar, or a small handmade toy carried the weight of centuries of tradition, honoring the night not through extravagance, but through thoughtfulness. Here, the essence of Christmas Eve, community, reflection, hope, was crystallized. It became a night in which emotional richness mattered far more than material wealth, a counterpoint to the commercialization that would intensify later in the century. World War II, however, once again challenged this balance. Families were separated across continents, cities were bombed, and lives were upended. Christmas Eve assumed a stark poignancy. Soldiers and civilians alike found themselves longing for home, for hearths, for the continuity of a tradition that spanned generations. Letters and broadcasts were lifelines. Gifts were sparse but meaningful. Rituals became vital anchors of humanity. Even in shelters or bombed-out cities, people recreated the rituals of the night, arranging candles, singing carols softly, sharing the few precious resources they had. The night's enduring power was evident. No matter the devastation, it held a unique ability to offer hope, connection, and emotional refuge. The post-war era ushered in new prosperity and new cultural shifts. Television, emerging in the 1950s, added a visual dimension to the night. Families could now watch stories about Christmas Eve unfold on screens, blending fiction and reality in ways that shaped imagination. Programs depicting families gathered around trees, children waiting for Santa, communities celebrating together became part of the collective understanding of the night. Television did not replace tradition, but it codified and amplified it, making certain images, trees, stockings, wreaths, candlelit windows, instantly recognizable and universally associated with the evening. During the same period, the commercial aspects of Christmas expanded significantly. Gift-giving became a central practice in many households, facilitated by department stores, catalogs, and eventually television advertising. Yet, even as the night increasingly included material elements, its emotional core remained. The anticipation of giving and receiving gifts paralleled centuries of anticipation and hope. The excitement of a story unfolding, the tender suspense of a sacred or symbolic night, the delight of being together. In homes large and small, in urban apartments and rural cottages alike, families preserved the essence of Christmas Eve. A momentary suspension of ordinary life, a celebration of connection, and a quiet acknowledgement of the years passing. The latter half of the 20th century saw globalization intensify the spread of Christmas Eve traditions. Media, migration, and trade ensured that customs from one corner of the globe could influence distant lands. American Christmas imagery, brightly decorated trees, stockings, Santa Claus, spread internationally, blending with local practices. In turn, European, Latin American, and Asian traditions infused their own regional flavors. Unique foods, ceremonial prayers, local music, and storytelling forms. Christmas Eve became simultaneously local and global, maintaining its emotional intimacy while participating in a broader cultural tapestry. Across continents, families lit candles, prepared meals, and told stories. Across time zones, children felt the same anticipation, experiencing the same wonder, as those who had lived centuries earlier in candlelit cottages or small town halls. Yet technology also began to subtly reshape the night in profound ways. Telephones allowed distant relatives to speak across hundreds of miles. Radios and television connected neighborhoods to larger communities. Airplanes transported gifts and families across continents. By the late 20th century, the digital world quietly began to intrude. Emails, early online messages, and digital photography allowed memories and greetings to travel further than ever before. Christmas Eve became not just a night of localized ritual, but part of a complex web of human connection stretching across the globe. And even as screens multiplied, the desire for the tactile, intimate experiences of tradition, lighting a candle, sharing a meal, singing together, remained central, testifying to the enduring human need for warmth and shared story. The night's traditions also evolved to reflect social change. Diverse households, single-parent families, multicultural communities, and blended families all adapted Christmas Eve rituals to their circumstances. The night became flexible, inclusive, and imaginative, capable of holding myriad forms of celebration without losing its essence. Candles remained symbolic, storytelling persisted, music endured, and anticipation retained its power. Across these adaptations, the core principle of Christmas Eve, the pause, the reflection, the shared emotional resonance, remained intact. It became clear that the night's strength lay in its emotional elasticity, its ability to hold meaning for each generation while maintaining a thread of continuity stretching back centuries. By the 21st century, Christmas Eve was celebrated in ways that would have been unrecognizable to its earliest observers, yet remarkably consistent in spirit. Streets and homes gleamed with lights, families, friends, and communities gathered in countless configurations. Songs, stories, and media reinforced the sense of magic and reflection. Children still anticipated gifts, though often within digitally mediated experiences. Adults still prepared meals, lit candles, and reflected on the year. Communities still sought to create moments of wonder, generosity, and warmth. The night had become a palimpsest, layered with millennia of meaning, absorbing cultural, technological, and social change while preserving a core emotional truth. It was a night for pause, for reflection, for connection, and for hope. Even today, when the world hums with electricity, travel, commerce, and media, Christmas Eve retains a timeless quality. Its magic does not reside solely in religious observance, family ritual, or commercial display, but in the combination of these elements and, most importantly, in the human heart. Candlelight, stories, meals, music, anticipation, and generosity all work together to create a suspension of ordinary time. In that suspension, humans can remember, dream, hope, and connect. Christmas Eve, in all its incarnations, from pagan solstice gatherings to medieval candles, from early modern rituals to the digitally connected modern night, remains a deeply human experience, a testament to the power of tradition, imagination, and shared emotion. Across centuries, across continents, across technologies and cultures, Christmas Eve has shown a remarkable ability to survive, adapt, and endure. It has withstood wars, famine, displacement, and economic hardship. It has absorbed and transformed religious, secular, folkloric, and commercial influences. And through it all, it has maintained a core identity, a night that is different from the rest, a night for pause and reflection, a night for wonder and togetherness, a night that reminds humanity of its capacity for hope, compassion, and joy. Even as families today may struggle with schedules, screens, and modern distractions, the essence of the night persists. A candle flickers on a windowsill. A family shares a meal. A child whispers a secret wish. A song is sung in harmony. Across the world, millions of people, perhaps billions, participate in a night that, in spirit, has remained the same for millennia. The longest night becomes a moment of light. Darkness becomes an invitation to reflection. Time becomes a story, and the story becomes shared. And so, Christmas Eve continues, carrying with it layers of history, culture, emotion, and imagination. From the solstice fires of prehistoric villages to the candlelit windows of modern cities, from whispered superstitions to broadcasted hymns, from homemade toys to globally mass-produced gifts, the night has endured as a touchstone of human experience. It is a night both intimate and universal, quiet and luminous, old and ever new. It is a pause in the flow of life, a thread connecting generations, and a reminder that even in the coldest, darkest season, light, warmth, hope, and wonder are possible. As we step fully into the 21st century, Christmas Eve has become a night experienced in countless ways, yet everywhere retains a shared emotional heartbeat. Across the globe, families, friends, and communities prepare for the evening with rituals that are simultaneously familiar and unique. Some homes glow with strings of colorful lights draped over trees, windows, and rooftops, while others honor the night with simple candles or lanterns, casting warm, trembling light on walls and hearths. The effect is universal. The flicker of light in darkness evokes a sense of safety, continuity, and quiet wonder. In this light, shadows dance gently across floors and ceilings, inviting reflection, memory, and anticipation. The modern Christmas Eve retains echoes of all its ancestors. From ancient solstice fires to medieval candles, from early modern ritual feasts to 20th century illuminated streets, each layer contributes to the texture of the night. People everywhere, regardless of culture, often seek the same sensations: warmth, comfort, community, and the feeling that time itself has paused. In some homes, children tuck themselves under blankets, imagining the coming morning and the gifts that might await. In others, quiet conversation flows over meals carefully prepared with love and tradition, each bite carrying a history that stretches back generations. Even the simplest gestures, a shared cup of cocoa, a well-wrapped gift, a soft whisper of a song, link the present to centuries of human experience. Technology, which in earlier centuries began as a tool for spreading awareness and later for broadcast, now adds new dimensions to Christmas Eve. Video calls allow families separated by continents to share the evening together. Social media carries images, messages, and greetings in real time, creating a sense of global participation. Children may see the twinkling tree of a cousin in another country or the snow-covered streets of a distant city. Yet, despite this digital expansion, the essence of the night remains tactile, intimate, and deeply human. Screens cannot replicate the warmth of a hand held, the smell of a kitchen filled with spices, or the hush that falls when a candle is lit in a quiet room. They supplement, rather than replace, the physical and emotional rituals that define the evening. For many, Christmas Eve begins with preparation, decorating trees, setting tables, and arranging gifts. The act itself is meditative. Hanging ornaments, untangling lights, and placing candles are not merely practical tasks, but ceremonies that mark the transition from ordinary time to sacred evening. The anticipation grows with each careful placement, each small adjustment, as though arranging the physical world can shape the emotional one. Families tell stories during these preparations, some stories rooted in the present, others reaching back through decades or even centuries. A child might hear for the first time about a great-grandparent who lit candles on Christmas Eve in wartime, or about a neighbor who made handcrafted gifts when money was scarce. Through storytelling, the night becomes layered, a living archive of human experience, a bridge across generations. Music remains a vital element of the evening, connecting the modern night to its long historical past. In homes, carols may be sung softly, sometimes a cappella, sometimes accompanied by piano or guitar. Choirs broadcast over radio, television, or streaming platforms reach millions simultaneously, filling living rooms and hearts with harmonies that have resonated for centuries. Even in bustling cities or remote villages, familiar melodies carry the emotional weight of anticipation, joy, and reflection. Music, more than any other element, connects the individual to the broader tapestry of humanity, reminding listeners that, despite distance and difference, the night is shared. Food, too, continues to anchor the night in sensory memory. Across cultures, families prepare meals that vary widely in ingredients, presentation, and scale, yet universally convey care, togetherness, and ritual. In some homes, roast meats, spiced breads, or sugar cookies evoke centuries-old culinary traditions. In others, local ingredients and modern interpretations produce entirely new dishes that honor the spirit of the night. Setting the table, arranging the platters, and sharing the meal together transforms eating into ceremony. Every bite becomes part of a continuum of celebration, linking the present to the past and embedding memory into flavor. In contemporary practice, gift-giving has expanded beyond physical objects. Letters, experiences, acts of service, or digital tokens of affection increasingly complement traditional presents. The act of giving retains the same emotional resonance that motivated early medieval exchanges, yet now includes new dimensions of creativity, personal connection, and storytelling. The exchange of gifts remains a form of communication, a way of saying, "I see you, I care for you, I honor our connection." And even as society becomes more secular, more diverse, and more technologically complex, these gestures retain the sacred rhythm that defines Christmas Eve. The slow unfolding of anticipation, the joy of shared experience, and the gentle closure of reflection before the night passes into sleep. For children, the night has always been a portal to imagination, and in the modern era, this continues in multifaceted ways. Stockings are filled with treats, small toys, or handwritten notes, echoing practices centuries old. Parents whisper stories of Santa Claus, Father Christmas, St. Nicholas, or local gift bearers, stories that merge myth, morality, and imagination. The ritual of setting out cookies, milk, or carrots for animals combines tradition with creativity, teaching patience, hope, and care. And as the night deepens, children slip quietly into sleep, dreams carrying them across snowy rooftops, candlelit streets, and centuries of shared wonder, connecting the modern child with every generation that has experienced the magic of anticipation on this night. Even adults experience a sense of quiet enchantment as the night progresses. For them, Christmas Eve is often a pause in the frenetic pace of modern life. Phones are silenced, lights dimmed, and rooms arranged to evoke calm and reflection. Some meditate, some read, some write letters or notes of gratitude, and some simply sit in silence, letting the night envelop them. The quietude of the evening is itself a form of celebration, a conscious recognition that, for a few hours, the world has slowed, and the ordinary has yielded to the extraordinary. In these moments, the night's essence becomes palpable. Time is suspended, memory and hope intermingle, and the human spirit, momentarily unburdened, rests in connection and wonder. Across the world, even the most subtle rituals carry the weight of history. A single candle on a windowsill evokes the medieval practice of lighting homes for night travelers. A simple song, hummed softly in a living room, echoes centuries of carolers. A quiet prayer, whispered before a meal, resonates with ancient rites of reflection and gratitude. The ordinary objects and actions of Christmas Eve, candles, meals, songs, gestures, become repositories of human experience, each one carrying layers of meaning, both old and new. The night is both intimate and universal, immediate and timeless. Modern globalization has also brought new interactions and shared cultural moments. While homes maintain private traditions, Public spaces often celebrate Christmas Eve in ways that echo centuries-old communal gatherings. Town squares glow with lights, churches hold midnight services, and community choirs perform in plazas or parks. These public rituals reinforce the night's significance, linking private experience with collective memory. They provide a visual and auditory reminder that Christmas Eve is not merely a personal night, but part of a shared human story that spans centuries and continents. Technology continues to influence the night in subtle, profound ways. Digital storytelling, streaming concerts, and virtual gatherings allow people to participate in rituals far from their homes. Families separated by distance can share meals, open gifts, and sing together in real time. Even in a world of instantaneous communication, the night retains its meditative, reflective quality. Screens become portals, not distractions, allowing distant hearts to connect while preserving the quiet intimacy that defines the evening. In this way, the digital age expands the night's reach without diluting its core essence. Quiet reflection, long a hallmark of Christmas Eve, remains central in modern practice. Adults and children alike engage in acts of contemplation, gratitude, or meditation, recognizing the end of the year and the promise of the one to come. These moments of pause, whether in a bustling city apartment or a remote rural cabin, echo the ancient human impulse to acknowledge the passing of time, to honor continuity, and to create space for hope. The night is thus both personal and timeless, allowing each participant to connect inwardly while feeling part of something far larger. As midnight approaches, the world feels suspended between memory and expectation. Streets are quieter, candles burn lower, and the last carols drift softly into the night. Families tuck in children, savor lingering conversations, and savor the stillness that marks the boundary between one day and the next. In these final hours, the essence of Christmas Eve crystallizes. It is a night of connection, reflection, wonder, and hope. A night that carries centuries of human experience into the present moment. Even as traditions evolve, adapt, and spread globally, the emotional and psychological resonance of the night remains consistent. It is a night that reminds humanity of its capacity for care, empathy, and imagination. It is a night that bridges generations, linking the ancient with the modern, the local with the global. It is a night that invites quiet, reflection, and the acknowledgement of the beauty and fragility of life. In the stillness of a modern Christmas Eve, the candlelight flickers, casting gentle shadows across walls, tables, and trees. Outside, streets may be illuminated by strings of lights, softly glowing in the winter darkness. Children sleep, dreams carrying them across centuries of wonder. Adults rest, allowing the night to carry them into reflection and gratitude. And quietly, across the world, millions of hearts beat in unison, sharing an experience that transcends culture, geography, and time. As the hours pass, anticipation for the morning merges seamlessly with the quiet contentment of the night. Gifts lie hidden beneath trees, food rests in warmth, and songs linger in memory. The night is at once a conclusion and a beginning, a pause that honors the past, celebrates the present, and anticipates the future. It is in these hours, calm and unhurried, that the true magic of Christmas Eve unfolds. And so, as you close your eyes and drift into sleep, imagine the centuries of celebration, the countless fires and candles, the songs and stories, the meals shared and prayers whispered. Imagine the continuity of humanity, the quiet persistence of hope, and the gentle presence of light in the darkness. Let the night enfold you, carrying with it the calm, the warmth, and the timeless wonder of Christmas Eve, a night that began in mystery, grew through centuries of ritual, and continues today, connecting every heart to the enduring story of humanity's shared wonder and joy. Sleep now with the knowledge that Christmas Eve is more than a night. It is a living, breathing tradition, a meditation in time, a moment of pause, a bridge across generations, and a beacon of warmth, light, and hope. And as your breathing slows, as the world outside rests, the night itself continues, carrying its magic softly into every home, every heart, and every dream, until morning comes with the promise of continuity, celebration, and renewal.